Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku is Nox wakfu go back to time to see his own family in the universe of My Hero Academia. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world ended in silence. For 200 years, Nox's existence had been a symphony of cacophony. The frantic tick-tock of his own accelerated time, the grinding whir of his clockwork army, the shriek of metal as he carved razor times from the fabric of reality, and above all, the incessant, maddening whisper of the Elia cube. It was a promise, a goad, a tormentor, and a god, all humming with the stolen lifeblood of the world, wakfu. Now, all of that was gone. His magnum opus, the culmination of 2 centuries of sin and sacrifice, lay in ruins around him. The clock, a monstrous heart of brass and stasis, was fractured. His army of Grambos and Nozels was little more than scrap metal, their inner mechanisms cold and still. And the Elia cube, the cube was silent. It had rejected his plea. It had consumed his gathered wakfu, all the energy he had bled from the world of 12, and it had given him nothing but 20 minutes of dust. He stood before the tree of life, a skeletal figure encased in decaying armor. Yugo, the boy king of the Eliotropes, watched him with eyes that held not hatred, but a profound and terrible pity. That was the final insult. Not defeat, but pity. Nox's armored hand, once capable of stopping time itself, trembled as it reached up to his helmet. With a groan of protesting metal, he removed it. The face beneath was not that of a monster, but of a man hollowed out by grief. His skin was pale as bone, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. His hair, once a vibrant green, was now a shock of lifeless white. Only his eyes retained a flicker of their former intensity, emeralds dimmed by ages of obsession, now swimming in a final, abyssal despair. Dust began to flake from his gauntlets. His body, held together for so long by sheer will and the cube's power, was finally relinquishing its form. He was becoming one with the ages he had so desperately tried to rewind. All this. His voice was a dry rasp, the sound of rust and regret. All this, for 20 minutes of dust. He looked at the boy, at the dragon, at the monument to his failure. A single, crystalline tear, tinged with the faint blue of wakfu, traced a path through the grime on his cheek. His voice cracked, losing its mechanical affectation, becoming something small, something human. I just wanted my family back. The words hung in the air, the truest thing he had said in 200 years. It was the core of him, the tiny, terrified man who had lost everything and tried to fight God and time to get it back. It was the memory of a warm smile and gentle hands. A name, a face, a feeling he could no longer properly recall, but for which he had burned a world. He closed his eyes, ready for the oblivion he had earned. The crumbling accelerated, his legs turning to powder, his torso dissolving into a cloud of motes that mirrored the ashes of his family. This was the end. The final tick of his own broken clock. But oblivion did not come. Instead of the gentle fade into nothingness, a violent lurch seized the very atoms of his being. It was not a physical force, but a metaphysical one. It was as if reality itself had hooked its claws into the dust cloud that was once Nox and pulled. The silence was shattered by a soundless shriek that echoed only in his dissipating consciousness. The Elia cube, cradled by the boy Yugo, flared with an impossible, final burst of azure light. It wasn't the roaring inferno of power he had tried to stoke, but a single, focused, surgical beam of intent that shot across the dimensions and struck his essence. His last coherent thought was a single, bewildered word that had no place in his vocabulary. Ironic. The journey was an agony of unmaking. He was no longer dust, but pure information, stretched thin across a screaming void between worlds. He saw colors that had no names, felt concepts as physical blows, and heard the grating static of infinite possibilities. 200 years of memory, of Nox the watchmaker, were sandblasted by the transit, leaving behind only the core components. A burning sense of loss, a desperate need to return, and the phantom echo of a name. Izuku. Then came the reassembly. It was as painful as the unraveling. The universe he was thrust into began to stitch him back together, but it used the wrong thread. It was a clumsy, painful process. He felt the phantom sensation of bones snapping into place, of skin being stretched over a form he hadn't truly inhabited in centuries. The first real sensation was the cold, a damp, biting chill that seeped into him, followed by a rough, gritty texture beneath him. The first smell was rot. The cloying stench of wet garbage, stale rainwater, and urban decay. The first sound was a rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water, echoing in a confined space. His eyes snapped open. There was no sky, no tree of life, no pitying heliotrope king. Only a graffiti-scarred brick wall, barely visible in the oppressive gloom of a narrow alleyway. He was lying on his back, his head pillowed by a burst-open trash bag. The world spun, a nauseating vortex of disorientation. Slowly, painstakingly, he pushed himself up. His body screamed in protest. He felt weak, fragile. The immense, divine power he had wielded was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow ache. He looked down at his hands. The intricate, blue and gold armor was gone. The clawed gauntlets, the reinforced plates, the whirring gears integrated into his very being, all vanished. In their place were simple, calloused hands. His clothes were bizarrely plain, a tattered black long-sleeved shirt and dark, worn-out trousers, both damp and smelling of mildew. They were the clothes of a vagrant, not a god. A tremor ran through him. He brought a hand to his face, his fingers tracing the unfamiliar/familiar contours. The skin was still unnaturally pale, but it felt like skin, not the magically preserved flesh jerky he had been for so long. He felt his hair. It was no longer white and brittle, but a dark, tangled mess of what felt like green. The color was hard to discern in the gloom, but the texture was softer, younger. He stumbled to his feet, using the damp wall for support. His legs were unsteady, like a newborn foal's. He felt a strange lightness, an absence of the crushing weight he had carried for 2 centuries. The armor. Its absence was as profound as a phantom limb. He had been a snail, his armor his shell. Now he was just a soft, vulnerable slug. A puddle of murky water had collected near a clogged drain. He staggered towards it, his heart, a real, beating heart, not a wakfu-powered mechanism, thumping a frantic, panicked rhythm against his ribs. He knelt down, his knees cracking in protest, and stared at his reflection. The face that stared back was a nightmare. It was the face of Izuku Midoriya, but as seen through a warped, cruel lens. He looked to be in his late 20s or early 30s, but his eyes were ancient. They were the eyes of Nox, filled with the bottomless sorrow and weariness of 200 years. His face was gaunt, a starvation thinness that spoke of more than just a lack of food. And across his skin, faint but undeniable in the dim light, were a network of impossibly fine, glowing blue lines. They pulsed with a slow, weak rhythm, like the dying embers of a great fire. Traces of wakfu, branded into his very biology. He was a living relic, a container for an energy that did not belong in this world. What is this? He whispered. His voice was his own. Not the filtered, metallic rasp of Nox, but the voice of the boy he had been, only deeper, rougher with disuse. He tried to access his power. He focused, mimicking the mental state that would allow him to stop time. He pictured the world freezing, the dripping water hanging suspended in the air. He whispered the familiar trigger word, a habit ingrained over centuries. Tick-tock. Nothing happened. The water continued to drip. The world continued to move. A surge of pure, unadulterated panic, an emotion he hadn't truly felt since before the Eliacube, seized him. He tried again, pushing his will outwards, trying to summon a razor-time blade to his hand. He felt a faint flicker of blue energy in his palm, a spark that died as quickly as it came, leaving behind only a deeper ache. The power was there, he could feel it, a deep well inside him. But it was locked, sealed away. And he felt something else, too. A hunger. A deep, gnawing, cavernous emptiness that demanded to be filled. In the world of 12, he had sated this hunger with the planet's wakfu. Here, what was there to consume? The distant wail of a siren cut through the air. A familiar sound. A sound from before. He had to get out of this alley. He had to see. He pushed himself away from the wall and stumbled towards the sliver of light at the alley's mouth. Each step was an effort. The sounds of the city grew louder, the rumble of traffic, the distant clatter of a train on elevated tracks, the murmur of voices speaking a language that flowed into his mind as effortlessly as breathing. Japanese? He hadn't heard it, spoken it, or even thought it in 200 years, yet it was as natural to him as the beating of his own heart. He emerged from the alleyway, blinking against the sudden brightness of the afternoon sun. The sensory assault was overwhelming. The world was a riot of color and motion. Sleek, strangely shaped cars hummed past on clean asphalt. People, so many people, flowed along the sidewalks like a river, their faces buried in glowing rectangles of glass and metal. The buildings towered over him, their surfaces covered in bright, flashing screens and advertisements. His head swam. This was Musudafu. It had to be. The shape of the skyline, the logo on the convenience store across the street, the design of the train station in the distance. They were all buried memories, unearthed by the sight before him. But it was all wrong. Newer. Cleaner. More advanced. He was a ghost, a man out of time. He took a hesitant step forward, his worn shoes scuffing on the pristine pavement. People gave him a wide berth. They saw a gaunt, wild-eyed man in dirty clothes, muttering to himself. They saw a threat, a problem, something to be avoided. The irony was bitter. He, who had once been a threat to a whole world, was now just a piece of urban refuse to be ignored. A loud honk startled him. He had wandered into the street. A car swerved violently to avoid him, the driver shouting a curse he barely registered. The mundane threat was so absurd, so insignificant compared to what he had faced, that it almost made him laugh. A dry, humorless sound escaped his lips. He staggered back to the safety of the sidewalk, his eyes scanning everything, desperately trying to find a point of reference, an anchor in this sea of temporal confusion. And then he saw it. High above, plastered across the side of a skyscraper, was a colossal digital billboard. It depicted a man, impossibly muscular, with a blinding smile and two prominent tufts of blonde hair that looked like rabbit ears. The man was rendered in bright, heroic colors, his iconic red, white, and blue costume a beacon of primary-colored optimism. All might. Noxuzuku's breath hitched. He remembered that smile. It was a symbol from his past, a faded icon from the life before the obsession. But the face, it was younger. So much younger. The lines of age and worry that had creased the hero's face in his own time were absent. This was All Might in his prime, radiating an aura of absolute invincibility. His gaze dropped from the hero's face to the bottom of the screen. In the corner, a line of text scrolled past, displaying news headlines, weather, and a small, simple piece of information that made the world tilt on its axis. The date. He stared, his mind refusing to process the numbers. He did the math, his brain, accustomed to calculating vast swathes of time, working with frantic speed. He subtracted the year he was taken. He accounted for the 2 centuries of his monstrous life as Nox. He calculated and recalculated, but the answer remained the same. It was impossible. It was a joke. A cruel, cosmic joke played on him by a cube that had a twisted sense of humor. He hadn't been sent back to his own time. He hadn't even been sent to the future. He had been sent to the past. He was home, but he had arrived years before he was ever taken. All his struggle, all his sins, all the wakfu he had drained, all the lives he had extinguished or ruined, it was all for this. To be deposited back onto the timeline like a piece of misplaced luggage, a paradox with no place to go. The 200 years of torment had been a closed loop, a pointless exercise in damnation that had led him right back to the beginning. Horror warred with a sliver of impossible, treacherous hope. If this was the past, then they were still here. They were alive. An instinct, deeper and more powerful than any conscious thought, took hold of his body. His feet began to move, carrying him through the crowded streets with a purpose that was not his own. It was a pilgrimage. His legs remembered the way, turning left at the familiar takoyaki stand, right at the underpass where he'd once seen a minor hero fight a purse snatcher. The city had changed, but its bones were the same. He was a wraith moving through his own history. People flowed around him, their vibrant life energy, their wakfu. He now saw it was everywhere, in everything, a stark contrast to his own dim, flickering existence. He was a void in the shape of a man. He didn't know how long he walked. Time had lost its meaning again. Finally, he found himself standing before a familiar, unremarkable building. A modest, slightly dated apartment complex. His breath caught in his throat, a painful, sawing sound. This was it. His old home. He moved into the shadows of a neighboring building, his body pressing against the cool brick, hiding him from view. He was terrified. What if it was empty? What if the date was wrong? What if this was all just a final, elaborate hallucination as his soul dissolved? His eyes found the window. 3rd floor, second from the left. The lights were on. A soft, warm, yellow glow that was the antithesis of his entire being. He could see movement inside. A figure, bustling back and forth. A woman with short, dark green hair tied back loosely. She turned, her profile visible for a brief, heart-stopping moment as she reached for something on a shelf. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, but a soft, gentle smile played on her lips. She was humming a little tune he couldn't quite hear. Inko Midoriya, his mother, not a faded, 200-year-old memory. Not a ghost he was chasing through time. She was real. She was alive. She was there, younger, with fewer worry lines than he remembered from his last days, but it was her. Unmistakably her. The smell of cooking, was that katsudan, drifted faintly on the evening air, a scent so deeply tied to his soul that it bypassed his brain, and struck him in the heart. The 200-year-old shell of Nox the watchmaker, the monstrous god-king who had laid waste to a world, did not crack. It did not fissure. It shattered. It exploded into a billion pieces of silent, screaming agony. The cold, calculated obsession, the rage, the madness, it was all washed away in an instant by a tidal wave of emotion so pure and powerful it brought him to his knees. It was love. It was grief. It was the crushing, soul-destroying weight of his own monstrous choices. He had done all this to get back to her, to his family, and here she was, oblivious, safe, and utterly beyond his reach. He was a ghost at the feast of his own past. A paradox that could not, must not, ever touch the life he had thrown away. To approach her would be to taint her, to bring the horror of his existence into her peaceful world. He was a monster, and monsters belonged in the shadows. A sob, raw and guttural, tore itself from his throat. It was the first sound of genuine, personal grief he had made in centuries. He clamped his hands over his mouth to stifle it, his body shaking uncontrollably. The faint blue lines on his skin flared with a brighter, more desperate light, fueled by the sudden, violent storm of his emotions. Tears, hot and real, streamed from his ancient eyes, carving clean paths through the grime on his face. He collapsed fully in the alley's shadows, curling into a ball on the cold, unforgiving concrete. The distant, happy sounds from the apartment, the clatter of a pan, the faint sound of her humming, were daggers in his soul. He had come home. And he had never been further away. The broken clockwork god wept, a forgotten son lost in the echoes of a life he could see, but never again reclaim. The grief that had shattered him in the alley was a merciless, physical force. It left him hollowed out, a fragile husk shivering on the cold concrete. For how long, he didn't know. Time, the concept he had once commanded with the arrogance of a god, was now a thick, syrupy poison he had to wade through. The sounds of the city, once distant daggers, became a dull, throbbing ache behind his ancient eyes. His mother was alive. His past was his present. And he was a ghost, cursed to haunt its edges. Survival, however, is an instinct more primal than grief. The cold began to seep into his bones, a real, physical cold that his new, vulnerable body could not ignore. The gnawing emptiness in his core, the hunger for wakfu, began to assert itself again, a low hum beneath the roaring agony of his heart. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't be found. A paradox of his nature, a walking temporal anomaly reeking of an alien energy, would be a beacon to anyone with the senses to perceive it. He needed a shell. A fortress. A place to hide from the world, and from himself. He pushed himself to his feet, his body a symphony of protest. Every joint ached, every muscle trembled with weakness. He was a marionette whose strings had been cut, moving on the phantom memory of motion. He pulled the hood of his tattered shirt over his tangled green-black hair, shadowing his unnaturally pale face and the faint, telltale blue glow of his wakfu-laced veins. He needed to be invisible. He began to walk, with no destination in mind, only a direction, away. Away from the warm glow of his past, away from the bustling heart of the city. He moved like a wraith, sticking to the shadows, his steps unnaturally silent. The city at night was a different beast. The crowds thinned, the frantic energy giving way to a low, electric hum. He saw heroes on patrol, their colorful costumes stark against the neon-lit darkness. He recognized some of them from his old notebooks, their faces younger, their careers only just beginning. Each one was a stab of nostalgia, a reminder of the boy who had dreamed of joining their ranks, a boy whose dream he had, in a way, murdered. His instincts, honed over 2 centuries of survival in a hostile world, guided him. He sought height. He sought isolation. In his life as Nox, his lairs had always been high, defensible positions from which he could survey his domain. The impulse remained. His eyes scanned the skyline, past the gleaming corporate towers and residential high-rises, searching for something else. Something forgotten. And then he saw it, silhouetted against the moonlit clouds. It was a relic from another era, a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the modern sky. An old, European-style clock tower, built of dark stone and brick, probably a century old. It stood on the industrial outskirts of the city, surrounded by dormant warehouses and silent rail yards. Its 4 faces were dark, the hands frozen at 3:15. It was a monument to stop time. The irony was so potent it was almost a physical blow. It was perfect. The journey there was a trial. He was weaker than he had ever been. By the time he reached the rusted iron gate at the tower's base, he was panting, his vision swimming. The gate was locked, chained shut with a thick, corroded chain. A mortal obstacle. In his prime, he would have aged it to dust with a touch. Now he had to be smarter. He looked around. The street was deserted. He closed his eyes, concentrating, reaching for the well of power deep within him. It was there, a tempestuous sea locked behind a dam of his own fragile mortality. He pushed, not with the brute force of Nox, but with the focused precision he was beginning to relearn. He whispered the old, familiar words, tick-tock. The world did not freeze. It didn't even grind to a halt. Instead, it was as if a thick layer of molasses was poured over reality. The low hum of a distant transformer dropped several octaves into a guttural drone. A piece of newspaper, tumbling in the wind, slowed its descent, each flutter taking an eternity. He had created a bubble of slowed time, a small pocket where he was a king for a few precious seconds. The effort sent a lance of pain through his head, and the hunger inside him roared in response, demanding payment for the expenditure. He ignored it. He reached for the lock. His fingers, now moving at a perceived normal speed while the world crawled, worked at the rusted mechanism. It was old, simple. He found the weak points, the rusted pins. With a sharp, focused twist, born of centuries of tinkering with intricate machinery, he broke the internal tumblers. The lock clicked open. He released his focus. Time snapped back into its normal rhythm with a jarring jolt. The transformer's hum returned to its proper pitch. The newspaper hit the ground. The whole process had taken less than 10 seconds of real time, but to him, it had felt like a minute. It was a crude, draining use of his power, but it worked. He slipped inside, closing the gate behind him. The air inside the tower was thick with the scent of dust, ozone, and decay. Moonlight streamed through the high, arched windows, illuminating columns of dancing dust motes. The ground floor was cavernous, filled with the ghostly shapes of abandoned equipment covered in white sheets. In the center, a colossal brass pendulum hung motionless, a silent, metal heart. He began to climb. A winding stone staircase spiraled up the tower's interior wall. His ascent was slow, his breathing ragged. He passed level after level of complex, silent machinery, gears the size of tables, intricate arrays of levers and pulleys, all coated in a thick layer of grime and neglect. To most, it would be a junk heap. To the part of him that was still Nox, it was a familiar, comforting landscape. This was a language he understood. Metal. Time. Mechanics. Finally, he reached the top chamber, just below the belfry. It was a large, circular room with 4 enormous, grime-streaked clock faces for windows. The central mechanism, a labyrinth of brass and steel, sat dormant in the middle of the room. This would be his sanctuary. His nest. Over the next few days, he made it habitable. He was a scavenger, a ghost flitting through the edges of the city. He needed supplies. Using his time-slowing trick, he would visit 24-hour convenience stores in the dead of night. He'd cast his small temporal net, turning the cashier into a statue, the security cameras into blind eyes. He never took much. A bottle of water. A few protein bars. A loaf of bread. Things that wouldn't be immediately missed. His pride, the last vestige of the boy Izuku, warred with the practicality of the watchmaker Knox. He couldn't just steal. So, he would leave payment. A few crumpled, old-looking yen he'd find in dusty corners of the tower, or a small, perfectly polished stone left on the counter. A symbolic gesture that meant everything to him and nothing to the world. He acquired tools from an abandoned workshop, a blanket from a laundromat's lost and found. He used his nascent energy manipulation, a flickering blue light that danced on his fingertips, to mend a broken section of the floorboards and seal a drafty window. He cleared the dust from one corner of the chamber, laying out his meager possessions. It was a pathetic hovel compared to the mechanical fortresses he once commanded, but it was his. It was safe. With his immediate survival secured, he could finally turn his attention to the true, terrifying problem. Himself. He stood in the center of the clock room, the moonlight from the 4 giant faces casting long, distorted shadows. He needed to know what he was, what he could do. This body was a new, unfamiliar machine, and he needed to read the manual. He began with the most fundamental power. He held out his hand, palm up, and focused on a single dust mote dancing in a moonbeam. He gathered his will, not as a command, but as a request to the power coiled within him. Tick-tock. The world went silent. The dust mote froze mid-air. The distant city lights seen through the grimy glass ceased their faint twinkling. The very air felt solid, crystalline. This was it. The absolute stasis he remembered. But it was different. It was a strain. A crushing pressure built behind his eyes, and the hunger, the damned hunger, clawed at the walls of his stomach. He felt his own life energy, his own wakfu, being consumed to fuel the effect. He could hold it for maybe 30 seconds at most before the cost became too great. He released it. The world breathed again. Next, teleportation. The Zealer's step. He focused on the other side of the room, near the base of a giant, silent gear. He remembered the feeling, not of moving from A to B, but of ceasing to exist at A and beginning to exist at B. He pulled at the fabric of space, wrenching it open. With a sound like tearing canvas and a brief, sharp smell of ozone and old parchment, he was there. It was jarring, nauseating. He stumbled, catching himself on the cold metal of the gear. It worked, but it was clumsy, raw. His armor had always acted as a buffer, a focusing lens that made these transitions seamless. Without it, he felt every violent shudder of space-time as he ripped through it. Another drain on his reserves. Another spike of hunger. Finally, energy manipulation. He held out his hand, willing the blue power to coalesce. In his past life, he could summon swords of solidified time, project devastating beams, create armies from nothing but wakfu and metal. Now he focused, and a faint, flickering blue light shimmered into existence above his palm. It wavered unstable. He tried to give it form, to shape it into the simple image of a wrench. The light contorted, struggled, and then fizzled out with a sad little pop. He could draw on the energy, but he couldn't give it stable form. It was raw power without a conduit. His armor had been the conduit. The Eliacube, which he had foolishly tried to master, had instead mastered him, weaving its power into his soul but making his body an insufficient vessel. He was a cracked bottle trying to hold an ocean, and with every test, every minor exertion, the hunger grew. It was no longer a dull ache. It was a living entity within him, a parasite with claws and teeth. He staggered to one of the giant clock faces, his hands pressed against the cold, grimy glass, and looked out over the city. He did not see a metropolis. He did not see buildings, cars, or lights. He saw a feast. His new/old perception, gifted and cursed by the Eliacube, showed him the truth of this world. Everything that lived possessed wakfu. It was the life energy, the spiritual essence of all things, and Muzitifo was a nexus of it. Millions of souls, each one a shimmering, vibrant aura of light. The city was a vast, glittering ocean of energy, and he was a man dying of thirst on its shore. The people walking the distant streets were no longer people. They were brilliant, tempting flames of blue, green, and gold. The trees in the parks were deep, steady pillars of emerald light. Even the stray cats and scurrying rats were tiny, flickering sparks. He could feel the collective hum of it all, a siren song promising satiety, power, and an end to the gnawing emptiness. The Nox persona, the part of him that had drained whole forests and ecosystems without a second thought, rose from the depths of his consciousness. It was a simple, logical solution. He was starving. There was food. He just had to reach out and take it. His hand rose, pressing against the glass. His fingers twitched. He could do it. He could feel how. He could extend his will, his very essence, and draw a fraction of that energy into himself. Not enough to kill anyone. Just a little taste. A sip from the ocean. Who would notice? 1,000 people might feel a momentary chill, a brief wave of fatigue, and then it would be over. And he would be whole. He would be strong again. Do it, the voice of the watchmaker whispered in his mind. It was a cold, pragmatic voice, honed by 200 years of putting the mission above all else. You need the energy. To survive, to protect yourself, to watch over them. This weakness is a liability. His fingers splayed against the glass, the faint blue lines on his skin glowing hungrily. He could feel the connection, the tantalizing pull of the city's collective life force. It wanted to flow into him, to fill the void. But another voice, a much smaller, much older voice, screamed in protest. It was the voice of a boy who cried when he saw heroes save people. A boy whose entire being was oriented around the concept of self-sacrifice, not parasitic survival. No! You can't. That's their life. It's not yours to take. The internal conflict was a physical war. His body trembled violently. Sweat beaded on his brow. The watchmaker argued for survival, for power. The hero screamed about morality, about right and wrong. He was caught between the monster he had become and the boy he once was, and the strain was tearing him apart. With a choked cry, he snatched his hand back from the glass as if it were white-hot. He stumbled backwards, clutching his head, his knuckles white. He collapsed to his knees, doubling over as a wave of agony and self-loathing washed over him. The hunger, denied its prize, lashed out, sending cramps through his stomach that felt like he was being disemboweled. No, he gasped, his voice a ragged whisper to the silent ears. I won't. I will not become that again. Not here. He had destroyed one world for the memory of this one. He would rather fade into nothingness than become a blight upon its reality. This was his penance, to live with this eternal, ravenous hunger, and to deny it, every second of every day. He stayed on the floor until the shaking subsided, until the roaring hunger receded to a manageable, gnawing ache. His resolve, forged in the fires of that terrible temptation, was now made of steel. He could not be a destroyer. He could not be a participant. He had to find another way. And so, he became the observer. He couldn't risk going out, not with the constant threat of his hunger. His tower was his prison and his sanctuary. But he had to see. He had to know. He spent the next day in deep meditation, not testing the brute force of his powers, but their finesse. He gathered a small, stable mote of his blue energy, and instead of trying to shape it, he willed it to become a lens. An extension of his senses. The mote shimmered and flattened into a disk of shimmering, translucent light, about the size of his palm. It hovered in the air before him. He pushed his consciousness into it, and the room vanished, replaced by a dizzying, high-altitude view of the city. By focusing his will, he could move the lens, zooming in, turning corners, even passing through solid objects, though that took more energy. It was a perfect, undetectable scrying tool. His first target was obvious. He sent the lens flying across the city, homing in on the familiar coordinates of his old school. Aldera Junior High. The lens phased through the school's outer wall, gliding silently down the hallway. He saw the classrooms, the students, the teachers. It was all so painfully familiar. He found the right classroom, and there he was, his younger self. He was scrawny, his posture terrible, hunched over his desk as if trying to make himself a smaller target. His green hair was an untamable explosion, and his face was a constellation of freckles. He wasn't paying attention to the teacher. He was muttering under his breath, his hand flying across the pages of a battered notebook, hidden beneath his textbook. Hero Analysis for the Future number 13. A wave of complex emotions washed over the watchmaker. The first was a cold, analytical assessment from the Nox persona. Pathetic. Small. A daydreamer. He invites the abuse. All he thinks about is heroes, yet he can't even stand up for himself. Weak. The judgment was a shield, a way to distance himself from the pathetic creature on the screen, to deny that this boy was him. But the shield cracked. The dormant soul of Izuku Midoriya felt a phantom ache of recognition. He remembered the burning passion behind that muttering, the desperate, all-consuming need to be a part of that world of heroes, even if only as an analyst. He saw the fierce intelligence in the boy's eyes, the way he analyzed the heroes on the news with a tactical acumen far beyond his years. He saw the hope. That damn, stubborn, indestructible hope. The school bell shrieked, signaling the end of the day. The watchmaker kept his lens focused on his younger self. The teacher, holding up the burned notebook, made his callous remarks about Yue Hai. Young Izuku flinched but didn't protest. Then came the confrontation he had been dreading and expecting. Katsuki Bakugo. He swaggered over, flanked by his two sycophantic cronies. The casual cruelty, the arrogance, the explosive crackle from his palms. It was all exactly as he remembered. Bakugo snatched the notebook, his words dripping with contempt. Still at it, huh? You're a damn quirkless reject, Deku. The watchmaker watched, his fists clenching at his sides in the darkness of his clock tower. The scene played out like a half-remembered nightmare. Bakugo burned the notebook, the smell of scorched paper a phantom scent in the watchmaker's memory. He tossed it out the window. His parting words, the suggestion that his useless childhood friend take a swan dive off the roof, were delivered with a sneer. In that instant, the two halves of his soul went to war. The watchmaker, the god-killer Nox, surged forward in his mind. The rage was a cold, blue fire. It would be so easy. A flick of his will, he could reach through his scrying lens, his power arcing across the city. He could stop Bakugo's heart for a single, terrifying beat. He could freeze the blood in his veins, give him an aneurysm, make his own quirk backfire catastrophically. He could snuff out this arrogant, cruel little boy like a candle flame, and the world would be better for it. The power thrummed under his skin, begging to be used. The voice of Nox was a seductive hiss. End him. He is a tormentor. An obstacle. Erase the problem. Be the power this pathetic child wishes he had. But Izuku, the boy who revered All Might, the soul who believed in saving people, not punishing them, recoiled in absolute horror. No! Stop! That's not what a hero does. You can't. He's just a kid. He's Kaken, the watchmaker faltered. Kaken. The childhood name, a relic of a friendship that had curdled but was never truly erased, was a bucket of ice water on his cold fury. He watched, paralyzed by his own internal war, as his younger self just stood there, trembling, taking it. He didn't fight back. He didn't even cry. He just absorbed the cruelty. His shoulders slumped in defeat. The watchmaker, perched in his lonely tower, clenched his fists so hard that his knuckles turned white and the faint blue lines on his skin flared with repressed power. The air in the clock room grew cold, and a fine layer of frost began to creep across the floor around his feet. He was a god, fighting a war against himself for the right to let a little boy suffer, because he knew, with a terrible, soul-crushing certainty, that this suffering was necessary. This pain, this humiliation, this moment of utter despair, was a crucible. It was a vital ingredient in the forging of the hero he was supposed to become. He couldn't interfere. He couldn't save him. He could only watch. His scrying lens followed young Izuku as he retrieved his soggy, scorched notebook from the koi pond. He watched him walk home, a solitary, defeated figure, and the watchmaker, the monster of time and space, stood alone in the heart of his silent, broken clock, his ancient face a mask of anguish. This was his true prison. Not the tower, but this role. The helpless, all-powerful ghost, guardian of a past he could never touch, forced to witness every painful step of a journey he had already abandoned. The new rhythm of his existence was a torment measured in heartbeats he wished would cease. He did not sleep. Sleep was a luxury for the living, a function of a body that repaired itself through rest. His form, a paradoxical fusion of mortal flesh and celestial energy, simply entered a state of low-power stasis. He would sit motionless on the cold stone floor of his clock tower, the four giant faces his silent companions, and let the world blur into a slow, humming drone. But even in this suspended animation, the hunger was there. It was the background radiation of his new reality, a constant, gnawing emptiness that pulsed in time with the faint blue light of his own veins. As the first slivers of dawn painted the eastern sky a bruised purple, his eyes would open. The hunger would sharpen, a predator stirring at the sight of its waking prey. The entire city of Muzidafu was coming alive, a million tiny flames of wakfu igniting one by one, creating a symphony of life energy that called to the void within him. He fought it down, a familiar battle now, clamping down on the instinct with a force forged in 2 centuries of obsession. This obsession was now turned inward, repurposed from a weapon against time into a shield against himself. He raised a trembling hand, and a mote of blue light flickered into existence above his palm. With practiced focus, he flattened it, stretched it, shaped it into the familiar disk of his scrying lens. He pushed his consciousness into it, and the dusty confines of the tower dissolved. He was soaring, an invisible eye above the awakening city. The lens was his connection, his curse, his only window to the world he could not join. He didn't need to search. An instinct deeper than memory guided the lens, down through the familiar streets, past the corner store, and to the third-floor apartment window. He phased the lens through the glass. The scene was achingly domestic. Inko Midoriya, his mother, was in the small kitchen, humming a cheerful tune as she expertly prepared a bento box. The smell of tamagoyaki and fried ginger, phantom sensations that his lens couldn't transmit but his memory supplied with cruel fidelity, filled his mind. Young Izuku was at the table, shoveling rice into his mouth while simultaneously trying to scribble in his notebook. He was already dressed in his black Gakurin uniform. The watchmaker watched the easy interaction, the way his mother chided his younger self for not chewing properly, the way the boy just grinned back, his mouth full. It was a simple, beautiful moment, a single perfect pearl of a memory being created right before his eyes. And for him, it was like swallowing broken glass. This mundane love was the very thing he had waged a war against reality to reclaim, and seeing it now, so close and so untouchable, was an exquisite form of torture. He saw his younger self grab the scorched hero analysis for the future number 13 and stuff it into his bag. The sight of the damaged book sent a flicker of cold rage through him before he suppressed it. He followed the boy all the way to school. The journey was a cascade of half-forgotten details. The specific crack in the pavement he always tried to avoid, the vending machine that was always out of his favorite drink, the sound of the train roaring overhead at the underpass. The watchmaker's lens drifted behind his younger self, a ghostly guardian angel powerless to do anything but observe. The school day was a unique form of hell. He positioned his lens in a corner of the classroom ceiling, a silent, unseen security camera. The lessons, math, history, literature, were so mind-numbingly simple to his 200-year-old mind that he felt a kind of intellectual vertigo. He had once calculated temporal vectors and multidimensional energy equations on the fly. Now he was forced to rewitness a lecture on the feudal period. He didn't focus on the teacher. He focused on the boy. Young Izuku was a study in contrasts. To the outside world, he was a quiet, nervous student, trying to make himself invisible. But the watchmaker could see the fire within. The boy wasn't just taking notes on the lesson. He was secretly sketching a hero's costume redesign in the margins, his lips moving in a silent, frantic monologue. The watchmaker could almost hear the muttering, "No, the support material on the joints should be more flexible. Maybe a polymer weave like the one Backdraft uses for his hoses, but reinforced for kinetic impact." The Nox persona scoffed. Foolish. A waste of a sharp mind on childish fantasies. but the Izuku's soul stirred in recognition. Brilliant. He's solving problems he hasn't even been given. He sees the world in terms of how to make it better, how to save people. The day wore on, a slow procession of mundanity, until lunchtime. This was when the shadows grew longer. Young Izuku tried to eat his bento alone, finding a secluded spot behind the gymnasium. But seclusion was not safety. It was an invitation. They found him, of course. It wasn't even Bakugo this time, which was somehow worse. It was his two lackeys, the boy with the extendable fingers and the one with the useless-looking wings. They were hyenas without their lion, emboldened by the absence of a teacher's gaze. Still eating by yourself, Deku? The finger boy taunted, stretching one of his digits to an unnatural length to poke at the meticulously prepared bento. Guess no one wants to eat with a quirkless freak. Young Izuku flinched, pulling his lunch closer. Leave me alone, he mumbled, his eyes fixed on his rice. What's that? We can't hear you, the winged one chimed in, stepping closer. You gotta speak up. Or are you too scared? The scene was petty. It was childish. And to the watchmaker, it was an act of profound injustice that resonated with centuries of accumulated rage. His focus sharpened. Through his lens, he saw not two teenage bullies, but two sources of aggression, two vectors of needless cruelty disrupting the balance. The air in the clock tower dropped 10 degrees. They are insignificant, the voice of Nox whispered, cold and precise. Insects. A minor annoyance. But they cause pain. The logical solution is to remove the source of pain. A demonstration of power would ensure they never bother him again. It would be efficient. His hand lifted in the dark chamber, fingers curled into a claw. The blue wakfu lines on his arm blazed to life, no longer a faint network but a brilliant, angry circuit board. He could feel his power responding, coiling like a serpent ready to strike. It would be so easy. A pulse of focused energy. Not to kill, not even to harm, really. Just to disrupt. He could use a temporal distortion to make them trip and fall in a humiliating tangle. He could subtly manipulate the electrical signals in their brains to give them a blinding migraine. He could age the soles of their shoes into dust, sending them sprawling. 1,000 minor torments, all designed to teach a lesson. A lesson in consequences. His power surged, gathering in his palm as a swirling vortex of shimmering blue. The dust on the floor around him stirred, caught in a miniature cyclone of raw energy. He locked onto the finger boy's wakfu signature, a flickering, arrogant little flame. But then he saw his younger self's face. The boy wasn't angry. He wasn't defiant. He was just sad. He looked resigned, as if this was simply the price of his existence. And in that moment of profound empathy, the nascent hero soul within the watchmaker screamed, "Stop! This isn't the way. A hero doesn't use his power to punish bullies. He protects people. You're becoming the monster, not them." And the watchmaker froze. The image of Yugo, the boy king, flashed in his mind, the pity in his eyes. The feeling of crumbling into dust, a failure. He had used his power to force his will upon the world, and it had led to nothing but ruin. Was he about to make the same mistake, on a smaller, more pathetic scale? The internal war was titanic. The cold logic of Nox versus the burning heart of Izuku. The God King versus the hero wannabe. He was a being of immense power, and the single most difficult thing he could do was nothing. It was an act of restraint so profound it felt like self-mutilation. With a ragged snarl that echoed in the empty tower, he clenched his fist, extinguishing the vortex of power. The light on his arm dimmed. The air warmed. The moment passed. He had won. He had lost. He forced himself to watch as the bullies, bored with the lack of reaction, knocked the bento box from young Izuku's hands. The carefully arranged food scattered in the dirt. They laughed, a cruel, ugly sound, and walked away, leaving him to stare at his ruined lunch. The watchmaker felt each of their jeering laughs like a physical blow. He watched his younger self carefully pick the salvageable pieces out of the dust, his shoulders trembling. The rest of the day was a blur of impotent fury and suffocating sadness. When the final bell rang, the watchmaker didn't follow his younger self home. He couldn't. He needed something else. He needed to understand the boy he was, the boy he had just failed to protect. He sent his lens to the apartment. It was empty. Inko was likely grocery shopping. Young Izuku was taking the long way home, probably to the koi pond again. He had a window. The decision was reckless, a violation of his own self-imposed quarantine, but the compulsion was too strong. He needed to be there. He needed to touch his own past. He gathered his power, focusing on the image of his old bedroom in his mind. The teleport was messy, violent. He ripped through space with the sound of tearing reality, the stench of ozone filling his nostrils, and reappeared not in the room, but embedded halfway through the closet door. Panic surged. He was stuck, an abomination of physics. He pushed, pouring more of his precious, limited energy into the effort, and stumbled forward, crashing into a pile of clothes and falling to the floor of his old bedroom. For a long moment, he just lay there, panting, the hunger screaming at the needless expenditure of power. The room was just as he remembered, yet seeing it, being in it, was a sensory overload that threatened to short-circuit his mind. It was a shrine to all might. Posters of the hero's incandescent smile beamed down from every wall. Action figures in dynamic poses stood guard on his shelves. The iconic red, white, and blue was everywhere. The watchmaker got to his feet, his movements slow, reverent. He ran a trembling finger over the smooth plastic of a Silver Age All Might figurine. The memory was so sharp it felt like it happened yesterday. Begging his mother for it for his birthday, the sheer joy of unwrapping it. He breathed in. The room smelled of clean laundry, dusty electronics, and pencil shavings. It smelled of home. It smelled of a safety and innocence he hadn't known in 200 years. He was a profane thing in this sacred space, a creature of shadow and despair standing in a child's sun-drenched bedroom. His gaze fell upon the desk. It was cluttered, messy, but organized in its own chaotic way. And there, stacked neatly in the corner, was the legacy of his obsession. The Hero Analysis for the Future notebooks. He reached out a gaunt hand and picked up the topmost volume, number 12. The cover was worn, the corners soft. He opened it. The pages were a riot of information. Meticulous drawings of heroes, annotated with tiny, precise handwriting. Strengths, weaknesses, costume materials, potential support items, ultimate move mechanics, speculated psychological profiles. It wasn't hero worship. It was genius. It was the work of a brilliant tactical mind dissecting his world, trying to understand the mechanics of salvation. He saw his analysis of the hero edge shot. He hadn't just noted the hero's speed, he had calculated the probable tensile strength of his body in its flattened form, and hypothesized about his respiratory needs during high-speed maneuvers. He saw a page on the Rescue Hero 13, with detailed theories on the safety parameters of her black hole quirk and suggestions for containment field emitters to minimize collateral damage. The watchmaker, who had designed armies and siege engines, recognized the thought process. The problem-solving. The relentless drive to analyze, understand, and improve. He had used this same intellect to drain the life from a planet. This boy, this pure, hopeful version of himself, had used it to try and figure out how to better save it. The contrast was a physical sickness. He felt a profound wave of mourning, not for his lost family, but for this boy. He mourned the death of this potential, a death he himself had committed when he first touched the LE cube. His fingers brushed against the next notebook in the stack. Number 13. He didn't even need to open it. The cover told the story. The top corner was blackened, the paper warped and brittle from fire, the edges stained a faint gray from the fish pond's water. He traced the burnt edge with his finger, his touch impossibly gentle, and something broke in the dam of his memory. It wasn't a vision. It wasn't a full memory. It was a sensory flash, a psychic shrapnel wound, the sting of heat on his shoulder. The acrid smell of burnt paper mixed with a sweet, cloying scent like caramel, nitroglycerin. A booming, angry voice echoing in a classroom, swan dive. The feeling of utter bottomless worthlessness. The cold, slimy water of the pond. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned again, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His fragmented past was a minefield, and he had just stepped on a mine. The memory was incomplete, a broken piece of a puzzle, but the emotion attached to it was whole, pure, and devastating. The despair of that moment, 200 years ago, was as fresh as if it had happened 2 minutes ago. This notebook was a symbol, a testament to his humiliation. And yet, the boy hadn't thrown it away. He had rescued it. He had tried to dry its pages. He was still writing in it. The stubbornness, the sheer, idiotic, magnificent refusal to give up, it was the core of what made Izuku Midoriya who he was. The sound of the front door opening downstairs shattered his trance. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. Inko was home. Young Izuku would be right behind her. He couldn't be here. He couldn't be seen. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape. The window? Too slow. Teleport? Too risky, too draining. He might materialize in the middle of a wall again. Footsteps on the stairs. Closer. He did the only thing he could. He dove into the closet, pulling the door almost shut, leaving only a hairline crack to see through. He held his breath, forcing his body into utter stillness, praying his faint blue glow wouldn't be visible in the shadows. The closet smelled of mothballs and his own younger self's clothes. The intimacy of it was suffocating. He heard his younger self trudge into the room and drop his bag onto the floor with a heavy thud. Through the crack, the watchmaker saw his own slumped shoulders, his own defeated posture. He was a ghost watching his own past misery. Then, Inko appeared in the doorway. Izuku? You're quiet today. Is everything all right? Young Izuku didn't turn around. I'm fine, Mom. His voice was thick with unshed tears. She wasn't fooled. No mother ever is. She came into the room, her movements soft, her face etched with a loving concern that was a physical pain for the watchmaker to witness. Izuku, turn around. Let me see, he finally did. The watchmaker saw it clearly now. A fresh bruise was blooming on his younger self's cheek, an ugly purple mark against his pale skin, and there was a small scrape on his chin where he must have fallen when his lunch was knocked from his hands. Inko's breath hitched. A flicker of pain, fierce and maternal, crossed her face. But there was no anger. No cries of who did this to you. No demands for justice. There was only a profound, heartbreaking sadness. She already knew. This was a familiar ritual of their lives. Oh, my baby, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She gently cupped his unbruised cheek, her thumb stroking his skin. Come on. Let's get the first aid kit. We'll get you cleaned up. She led him out of the room, her arm wrapped protectively around his shoulders. The watchmaker remained in the closet, his body rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped the wooden frame of the door. He had watched his younger self be bullied. He had felt the rage, the cold, logical fury of Nox demanding retribution. He had wrestled with the morality of a hero. But this was different. This was the aftermath. This was the quiet, gentle love that tried to patch up the world's casual cruelty. This was the unconditional acceptance he had once been bathed in, a gift so constant, and so total that he had never even recognized it as a gift. He had taken it for granted, like the air he breathed. In his 200-year quest, the Elia Cube had whispered promises of getting his family back. He had pictured them as a concept, a static image of smiling faces from a life he could barely recall. He had thought his quest was to restore that image, to return to that place. He was wrong. It wasn't the image. It wasn't the place. It was this. It was this feeling. The feeling of a gentle hand on a bruised cheek. The feeling of a quiet voice full of love, chasing away the world's harshness. The feeling of being someone's entire world. He hadn't just lost his home. He had abandoned a paradise of love without ever knowing he was living in it. The weight of that realization was heavier than 2 centuries of time. It was the weight of memory made real, the weight of a love he could now see with perfect, agonizing clarity, knowing he was forever unworthy and incapable of experiencing it again. A single, silent tear, glowing with the faint blue of stolen wakfu, traced a path down his gaunt cheek and fell onto the floor of the closet, disappearing into the wood like a ghost's final offering. He had to get out. He was a profanity in this holy place. He waited until he heard the murmur of their voices fade downstairs, then, with a surge of desperate power, he tore himself out of reality and back into the cold, solitary darkness of his tower. He collapsed on the stone floor, not from the energy drain, but from the sheer, crushing weight of what he had just witnessed. He had finally understood what he had lost, and the knowledge was a sorrow far greater than death. The days that followed his infiltration of the past were a quiet, gray purgatory. The watchmaker confined himself to his tower, a self-imposed exile born of terror and a newfound, fragile piety. He was a contaminated thing, and the memory of standing in his old room, of being a profane presence in that innocent space, had branded itself onto his soul. He had tasted the forbidden fruit of memory, and its sweetness was an agonizing poison. His routine became a grim, monastic ritual. He would wake from his low-power stasis, choke down a dry protein bar that tasted like ash, and fight the morning's surge of hunger as the city's wakfu came online. Then, he would summon his scrying lens. It was a compulsion, a masochistic need to keep his eyes on the boy, to ensure the timeline was proceeding as it should, even if every second of observation was another twist of the knife in his heart. He watched young Izuku. He watched him go to school, his shoulders still slumped, but with a new, almost imperceptible spark in his eyes. The watchmaker knew what it was. It was the ember of hope, fanned by the promise of all might. He had witnessed his younger self's grueling training regimen at Dagoba Municipal Beach Park. A place he now saw was an ocean of discarded wakfu, a graveyard of forgotten objects that still held faint traces of life. He watched the boy drag refrigerators and tires, his small body straining, his determination a force of nature in its own right. And he watched All Might, in his skeletal Tashinori Yagi form, guiding him. The watchmaker's feelings toward the symbol of peace were a tangled, contradictory mess. There was the boyish reverence, an echo from a life before. There was the analytical respect of a fellow strategist, acknowledging the brilliance of the American dream plan. And there was a new, bitter resentment. Tashinori could be there. He could talk to the boy, guide him, mentor him. He could be the father figure Izuku so desperately needed. He could do everything the watchmaker, the boy's own future self, was forbidden from doing. He was a ghost pressed against the glass of his own life, watching a stranger take his place. He knew the date was approaching. The UA entrance exam. The culmination of 10 months of agonizing effort. The day the torch would be passed. His surveillance became more intense, more focused. He was a sentinel guarding a fixed point in history. The day arrived, bright and clear. He watched Izuku eat the strand of All Might's hair, a bizarre ritual that made the scientific part of his mind recoil, even as the hero-worshipping soul understood the symbolism. He watched him at the exam site, a nervous wreck among a sea of confident, powerful teenagers. He watched Bakugo shoulder past him, the same casual cruelty a constant, grating note in the symphony of the day. Then the exam began. The watchmaker's lens soared above the faux cityscape, a god's eye view of the chaos. He saw his younger self, paralyzed by fear and the overwhelming power of One for All, unable to score a single point. The Nox persona in his mind was scornful. Useless. He was given a god's power, and he cowers. He will fail. It is inevitable, but the Izuku soul knew better. Wait. It's not about points. It's about spirit. It's not time yet. And then it happened. The zero-pointer. The colossal robot smashed through the buildings, a behemoth of steel and rivets that dwarfed everything around it. The other examinees fled, a panicked tide of humanity. The watchmaker felt a phantom echo of all. It was a magnificent piece of engineering. He saw the girl with the gravity quirk, Achiko Uraraka, trapped under a piece of rubble, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He saw the terror in her eyes. And he saw his younger self, who had been running away with everyone else, stop dead in his tracks. He saw the boy turn. He saw the calculation in his eyes, the terror warring with a furious, protective instinct. And then, he saw the spark. One for all, a torrent of green lightning, crackled to life around him. The watchmaker held his breath in his silent tower. He remembered this feeling. The feeling of his body screaming no, but his soul screaming yes. Smash! The word was a silent roar in his memory, as he watched his younger self launch into the air, a green comet of pure heroic intent. He saw the fist connect, the colossal robot's head buckling, caving in, exploding in a shower of metal. It was a moment of absolute, transcendent glory. A moment of pure, unadulterated heroism, and then the fall. The broken limbs. The price of power. He watched Uraraka save him, her quirks slapping him out of his plummet. He watched Recovery Girl heal his catastrophic injuries. He watched him receive his acceptance letter. The watchmaker experienced it all through his remote lens, a silent, solitary audience to the birth of a hero. A profound, aching pride filled him, so potent it almost brought him to his knees. It was a pride inextricably woven with the deepest sorrow he had ever known. He did it. The boy I failed to be, he's doing it. But as the days bled into weeks, a new anxiety began to creep in, cold and sharp. The timeline was progressing, but he knew what was coming. The USJ. The first real taste of villainy. The first true test. His knowledge of the future, once a source of bitter irony, now felt like a ticking bomb strapped to his soul. He knew Shigaraki would come. He knew about the Nomu, the bioengineered monstrosity designed specifically to kill All Might. He knew Aizawa would be grievously injured. He knew the students would be scattered and terrified. He knew that All Might would be pushed to his absolute limit, burning through the last embers of his power. The thought was unbearable. To stand by and watch that unfold, knowing every detail, was a level of impotence he could not stomach. You can change it, the voice of Nox whispered, no longer a seductive hiss but a cool, logical proposition. A warning. An anonymous tip. You don't have to reveal yourself. Just a nudge. Push one domino, and the rest will fall differently. You can save Aizawa from the worst of it. You can prepare All Might. It is the logical, efficient, and compassionate course of action. The Izuku soul was terrified. No! We saw what happened when we just thought about interfering. The timeline is fragile. We can't. We must not. And do what? Watch them suffer? Watch Aizawa's bones be ground to dust by that monster. Watch All Might burn himself out fighting a battle you could have prepared him for? Is that what a hero does? Stand by and allow preventable harm? The logic was a steel trap, and his heroic soul was caught in its teeth. For days, the war raged within him. He paced the circumference of his clock room, a caged tiger tracing the bars of its prison. His shadow stretched long and distorted in the moonlight, a perfect metaphor for his own twisted nature. To act was to risk catastrophe. To not act was to be complicit in a catastrophe he knew was coming. He stood before one of the giant clock faces, his forehead pressed against the cold glass. He looked down at the city, at the endless ocean of wakfu. He could feel the USJ facility miles away, a complex humming with its own unique energy signature. He could feel the life force of the students who would soon be in danger. He felt the bright, steady flame that was Shota Aizawa. He felt the roaring bonfire that was All Might. And he could feel the cold, dead spot in the future where the Noma would appear, a creature with no wakfu, a hole in the fabric of life itself. His decision was made. Not by Nox. Not by Izuku. But by the watchmaker, the synthesis of the two. He would not be a passive observer to a tragedy he could mitigate. His penance was not to be useless, it was to be precise. He would not be a god, rearranging the board. He would be a whisper, a breath of wind that might, just might, nudge a piece into a safer square. He couldn't risk a direct warning. An anonymous call would be dismissed. An email would be traced. He needed a method as subtle and undeniable as his own existence. The day came. The day of the field trip to the unforeseen simulation joint. The watchmaker did not sit in his tower. He teleported, a clean, practiced jump this time, born of desperation and focus. He appeared on the roof of a building overlooking the road leading to the USJ. He cloaked himself in a localized time distortion field, not freezing time, but bending light and sound around him, rendering him effectively invisible and silent. He was a shimmer in the air, a ghost of heat haze. He watched the bus carrying Class 1A roll past. He saw his younger self's excited, nervous face in the window. He felt a pang of longing so sharp it almost broke his concentration. Then he waited. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy. He could feel it, the same way he could feel the pressure change before a storm. A warp gate. Kurogyri. A swirling vortex of purple-black mist bloomed in the center of the USJ plaza. The watchmaker, observing through a scrying lens he had prepositioned inside the dome, watched it all, the flood of low-level thugs. The appearance of Shigaraki, his posture a chaotic sprawl of discontent, his hands, his father's hands, a grotesque decoration, and the hulking, monstrous form of the Nomu at his side. The battle began. Aizawa, true to form, launched himself into the fray, a whirlwind of capture scarf and tactical takedowns. He was magnificent. A true underground hero, efficient and brutal. The watchmaker, a silent gargoyle on his rooftop perch, felt a surge of adrenaline. The temptation to intervene directly was a physical force, a gravity well pulling at him. The Elia cube, now a sentient part of his being, pulsed with hunger and opportunity. "End this," it whispered, its voice the grinding of ancient clocks. "You are a god to these insects. That creature of bone and muscle? A toy. The man of mist? A simple spatial anomaly you could unravel with a thought. The boy with the hands? A fragile child. A single motion, and it is over. Be the hero he wants to be. Show him what true power is." The watchmaker gritted his teeth, his jaw aching with the strain of his restraint. The blue lines on his skin flared, a visible manifestation of his inner turmoil. "No," he breathed, the words stolen by his distortion field. "This is his trial. Not mine." He watched Kurojiiri scatter the students. He watched his younger self, Tsuyu Ajiri, and Mineta get teleported to the shipwreck zone. He saw them fight for their lives, his younger self's brilliant, analytical mind kicking into gear, formulating a plan to defeat the aquatic villains. He felt that agonizing pride again, but his focus was on the plaza. On Aizawa, he watched his teacher fight Shigaraki. He saw the Nomu move, a blur of impossible speed and strength. He saw it catch Aizawa. The sound of the first impact, the sickening crunch of bone, was something his lens transmitted with perfect, horrible clarity. He watched as the Nomu smashed Aizawa's head into the concrete, again and again. The watchmaker's control snapped. He didn't think. He acted. An instinct born of 200 years of rage and a single moment of absolute horror. He didn't teleport. He didn't fire a beam of energy. He did something far more subtle, and far more draining. He reached out with his will, across the miles, and pushed against the flow of time itself, focusing on a single, infinitesimal point, the space occupied by Bakugo. On the other side of the dome, at the entrance, Bakugo and Kirishima had just finished incapacitating a group of villains. Bakugo was about to deliver his usual arrogant speech about mopping up the small fry, but then he felt it. A sudden, inexplicable shove. Not a physical shove, but an urgent, primal instinct that screamed go. Now, his own explosive quirk felt like it was trying to leap out of his skin, propelling him forward, toward the plaza. He didn't understand it, but Bakugo was a creature of instinct and aggression. He didn't question the urge to fight. He just obeyed it. "Kirishima, let's go. The real fight's in the center," he yelled, blasting himself forward a full 30 seconds earlier than he should have. The effect was immediate. As the Nomu raised Aizawa's broken body for another devastating slam, a massive explosion rocked the plaza. "Get the hell away from him," Bakugo roared, arriving like a ballistic missile. Shigaraki was startled, his hand flying to scratch at his neck in agitation. "What? You're not supposed to be here yet." The Nomu, its simple brain processing the new, immediate threat, dropped Aizawa's limp form to the side and turned its blank, horrifying gaze on Bakugo. The watchmaker, on his rooftop, sagged against the ledge, a wave of dizziness washing over him. The effort had been immense. He hadn't stopped or slowed time. He had manipulated causality itself, giving a specific person a push forward along their own personal timeline. It was like trying to nudge a single water molecule in a rushing river. The cost was staggering. His inner reserves felt dangerously low. The hunger wasn't just clawing at him anymore. It was feasting on his own essence. But it had worked. Aizawa was down, horribly injured but alive. He had been spared the final, killing blows. All might arrived. His I am here a thunderclap of reassurance that even the watchmaker felt in his bones. The confrontation he had dreaded began. "It's no use," Shigaraki cackled. "My Nomu has shock absorption. It was built to kill you." The fight was brutal. A clash of titans. All Might, the immovable object, against the Nomu, the unstoppable force. The watchmaker watched, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. His intervention with Bakugo had saved Aizawa, but it had a cost. The Nomu was now at full strength, not having expended any extra energy on finishing off the teacher. And All Might, arriving to a slightly different scene, was burning through his time limit faster, his initial attacks more ferocious, fueled by a rage that was less controlled than it should have been. He watched the symbol of peace be caught, the Nomu's liquid-like fingers digging into his old wound, drawing blood. He watched Kurogiri pin him. He saw the look of desperation on All Might's face, and then he saw his younger self charge. It was a suicidally brave, foolish, and perfectly heroic act. Young Izuku, his own power a broken, uncontrollable thing, ran forward to save the symbol of peace. The watchmaker felt his own phantom legs wanting to move, to run with him. In that moment, the boy running was not his younger self. It was just him. The two Izukus, separated by 200 years of hell, were one. The spirit was the same, the unyielding, self-destructive, magnificent drive to save others, even at the cost of himself. It was the most beautiful and most painful thing he had ever witnessed. The other students, inspired by his charge, joined the fray. Bakugo pinning Kurogiri. Todoroki freezing the Nomu. The tide turned. All Might, freed, saw his chance. He knew he was on his last embers. He had to go beyond. Plus ultra. The punches were a blur, a storm of kinetic force that shook the very foundations of the USJ. 100%. More than 100%. The Nomu was pummeled, its shock absorption overwhelmed by sheer, impossible force. The final blows sent the monster flying out of the dome and into the stratosphere. Silence. Then cheers. The watchmaker, on his rooftop, finally allowed himself to collapse. He slid down the wall, his body trembling with exhaustion and a flood of emotions too vast to name. He had done it. He had interfered. He had saved Aizawa from the worst of it. He had changed things. He had succeeded. But as he watched the steam pour off All Might's body, as he saw the hero struggle to maintain his form, a cold dread began to seep into him. He had forced All Might to go further, to push harder. He had saved Aizawa's bones, but what was the cost? How many more seconds, how many more precious embers of One for All, had been burned away in that final, furious barrage? He stared at the scene, at the triumphant but utterly spent symbol of peace. He hadn't averted a disaster. He had only altered its shape. He had traded one man's immediate, visible suffering for the accelerated decay of the world's greatest hope. The horrible realization crashed down on him with the weight of a dying star. The timeline wasn't a rope to be retied. It was a river. He had thrown a stone into it, and the ripples were spreading, distorting everything in their path. His intervention hadn't fixed anything. It had just created a new, unknown, and potentially far more dangerous future. He felt the same crushing, absolute futility he had felt as he turned to dust at the foot of the tree of life. He had played God again. And again, he had failed. He looked at his own trembling hands, the faint blue lines a testament to his hubris. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a god. He was just a fool, a broken clockwork man, forever meddling with a mechanism far too grand for him to comprehend. The aftermath of the USJ incident was a chaotic ballet of flashing lights and screaming sirens. The watchmaker remained on his perch, a statue of despair shrouded in a shimmering veil of bent time. His body was a war zone. The catastrophic expenditure of nudging causality had left his reserves dangerously depleted. The hunger, that ravenous parasite fused to his soul, was no longer a gnawing ache but a physical agony, a vortex of need that threatened to collapse him in on himself. He felt as if his very atoms were vibrating with starvation, but he could not leave. He was chained to this spot by a morbid, desperate need to see the consequences of his actions. His scrying lens, a faint and flickering disc now, stayed locked on the scene. He watched the other pro-heroes arrive, their faces a mixture of shock and grim determination. He watched the paramedics carefully load Aizawa onto a stretcher. His teacher's body was a mess of bandages and braces, but he was alive, conscious, his one visible eye burning with a cold fury. A wave of relief, thin and watery, washed over the watchmaker. He had at least succeeded in that. He had saved him from the worst. But his gaze was drawn, again and again, to the central figure. All Might. The symbol of peace stood tall, a bastion of calm amidst the chaos, giving a statement to the police. But the watchmaker could see what others couldn't. He saw the violent tremors running through the hero's monumental frame, tremors that All Might was suppressing with sheer, Herculean effort. He saw the steam pouring from his body, thicker and more voluminous than it should have been. He was a boiler pushed far past the red line, the pressure threatening to rupture the casing at any moment. The watchmaker had seen the original timeline in his fractured, Eliacube-fueled visions. All Might had been pushed to his limit then, too. But this was different. This was worse. The final barrage of punches against the Noma had been more ferocious, more desperate. It had been fueled by the extra seconds of rage and adrenaline from seeing Aizawa's broken form and the student's intervention. He had burned through more of his precious, finite time. The watchmaker had saved one hero by accelerating the decline of another. The cosmic scales had balanced themselves, and he was left with nothing but the bitter taste of his own arrogance. He watched his younger self being loaded onto the bus with the other students. The boy's face was pale with shock, his arm in a sling from where Recovery Girl had healed his shattered fingers. But his eyes were alight with a fierce, burning determination. He had faced true villainy, he had charged in to save his idol, and he had survived. He was no longer just a boy dreaming of being a hero. He was one. As the bus pulled away, All Might finally allowed himself to falter. He stumbled, catching himself on a piece of debris, and quickly ducked behind a shattered wall, out of sight of the remaining police and media. The watchmaker's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew what was coming. He had to be there. He dismissed the scrying lens, the effort making his vision swim. He gathered the last dregs of his accessible power, ignoring the screaming protest of the hunger. He focused not on the rooftop where he stood, but on another, a few blocks away. A nondescript, flat-top building that his younger self would soon be directed to. He pictured the rusted air conditioning units, the gravel-strewn surface, the specific pattern of water stains. With a sickening lurch and a sound like grinding teeth, he teleported. The transition was agonizingly rough. He didn't just appear. He slammed into existence, his knees buckling, sending him sprawling onto the rough gravel. The world spun violently. Black spots danced in his vision. The hunger was a physical claw, tearing at his insides. He felt as if he might simply discorporate, his form too weak to hold itself together. He pushed himself up, his body screaming. He had to hide. He staggered to the far side of the roof, behind a large, humming electrical substation. He leaned against the warm metal, panting, and wove the last threads of his power into a cloak of invisibility, a simple time distortion field that would make him little more than a whisper to the senses. He didn't have to wait long. He heard the telltale thud of All Might landing on the roof, the sound impossibly heavy for a man who should be light on his feet. A moment later, a scrawny, green-haired boy scrambled up the fire escape, looking bewildered. Young Izuku stared at the colossal figure of his mentor. All Might. What is it? Why did you call me here? I ran out of time, All Might said, his voice its usual booming baritone. And then it happened. In a grotesque, horrifying plume of steam, the mountain of muscle deflated. The hero vanished, replaced by a skeletal, emaciated man who looked more like a scarecrow than a savior. Toshinori Yagi coughed, a racking, wet sound, and blood sprayed from his lips, staining the front of his white shirt. Young Izuku, despite having seen this form before, recoiled in shock. All Might. From his hiding place, the watchmaker felt a phantom ache in his own side, a memory of an injury he had never personally received but whose consequences had defined 2 centuries of his existence. Seeing the wound, the horrific, caved-in scar tissue on Toshinori's torso, was like looking at the source code of his own damnation. That wound, that single moment of violence from All for 1 year ago, was the genesis of everything. It led to All Might's time limit, which led to his search for a successor, which led to him finding Izuku, which led to the transfer of One for All, which led to the path that eventually threw him into the world of 12. It was all connected, a terrifying, intricate web of causality. In that battle, Toshinori gasped, wiping the blood from his chin with a trembling hand, I used up my power. I can only be a hero for maybe 50 minutes now. A little less even. The watchmaker's blood ran cold. 50 minutes. In the original timeline, his fragmented visions had told him the USJ incident had reduced the limit to just under an hour. His interference, his heroic act of saving Aizawa, had cost the symbol of peace 10 precious minutes of his power. 10 minutes that could mean the difference between victory and defeat in a future battle. 10 minutes that could cost lives. The weight of his failure pressed down, threatening to crush him. But that's not what I wanted to talk to you about, my boy, Toshinori continued, his voice strained but firm. Today, you disregarded my instructions. I told you not to engage, to let me handle it. And yet you charged forward. Young Izuku flinched, his head bowing in shame. I'm sorry. I saw you were in trouble, and my legs they just moved on their own. The watchmaker watched, his breath caught in his throat. He was witnessing the most important conversation of his original life, from the outside. He was an alien observing a sacred rite. Toshinori was silent for a long moment. He looked at the boy, at his broken fingers, his trembling frame, his tear-filled eyes. The hero's gaunt face, so often a mask of pain and exhaustion, softened. A faint, weary smile touched his lips. When I saw you run toward that zero-pointer at the entrance exam, Toshinori said, his voice losing its admonishing tone, becoming something softer, more profound. A scared, quirkless boy, charging in to save a stranger, you reminded me of something. Of what it truly means to be a hero. The top heroes, we all have stories like that from our pasts. A moment where our bodies moved before we had a chance to think. He took a step closer, placing a bony, gentle hand on young Izuku's shoulder. Today, you did it again. You saw me, the symbol of peace, cornered and in danger. And you ran. It was reckless. It was foolish. And it was exactly what a true hero would have done. Young Izuku looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief, tears streaming freely down his face. And then came the words. The words that had once been the foundation of Izuku Midoriya's entire world. The words that had been buried under 200 years of rage and despair. Young Midoriya, Toshinori said, his voice thick with an emotion that was part pride, part gratitude, and part awe. You are more of a hero than anyone I know. The watchmaker flinched as if struck by lightning. The words didn't just enter his ears. They detonated in his soul. They were a key, turning a lock that had been rusted shut for centuries. You, too, can become a hero. The memory wasn't a flash this time. It was a flood. The rooftop after the sludge villain incident. The setting sun. The feeling of utter hopelessness. Of his dreams being crushed by the one person who could validate them. And then All Might, turning back, speaking those life-altering words. The feeling of the world shifting on its axis. Of light pouring back into a life that had gone gray. The pure, unadulterated, explosive joy. The feeling that he could fly. The feeling of being saved. That memory, so pure and so powerful, slammed into the cold, cynical fortress of Nox's consciousness. It was a battering ram of hope against the wall of despair. The 200 years of bitterness, of pragmatic cruelty, of cold logic, they couldn't stand against it. The memory was too strong. The emotion was too real. The cracks in his psyche didn't just widen. They shattered. His concentration broke. The distortion field around him wavered, flickered, and died with a faint pop, like a soap bubble bursting. He was no longer invisible. He was just a gaunt, terrifying figure in tattered clothes, standing in the shadows of the electrical substation, his unnaturally pale face a mask of agony. The shift in the air, the faint sound, was enough. Toshinori's hero senses, honed over decades of battle, screamed. In an instant he had moved, placing himself in front of young Izuku, his skeletal frame a surprisingly effective shield. Who's there? Toshinori snapped, his eyes, sunk deep in their sockets, blazing with suspicion. Show yourself, young Izuku gasped, stumbling back, his eyes wide with fear as he saw the figure in the shadows. He saw a man who looked like a walking corpse, gaunt and pale, with wild dark green hair. But the face, there was something horrifyingly familiar about the shape of it, the scatter of freckles almost invisible on the pale skin, And his eyes, they were a shade of green he saw every time he looked in a mirror, but they were filled with an ancient, unbearable sadness. The watchmaker was frozen. He was exposed. He had been seen. The cardinal rule of his existence, to observe, never to be observed, was broken. Panic, cold and absolute, clawed at him. The hunger, sensing his extreme distress and weakness, roared to life, and the blue lines on his skin flared erratically, casting a sickly, pulsing light on his face. "Stay back, young Midoriya," Toshinori warned, his voice a low growl. He didn't know what this man was, but he could feel the aura coming off him. It wasn't a quirk. It was something else, something ancient, alien, and deeply wrong. It felt like standing on the edge of a bottomless abyss. The watchmaker couldn't speak. His throat was locked tight. His mind was a maelstrom. The pure, radiant memory of All Might's validation was crashing against the horrified realization of his exposure. The monster and the boy were at war, and the battlefield was his very soul. He had to flee. He tried to gather his power to teleport, but his reserves were almost empty. The hunger was consuming everything. He managed a single, desperate step backward, his foot scuffing loudly on the gravel. The sound broke the spell. Young Izuku, seeing the man's distress, his terrifyingly familiar eyes swimming with what looked like tears, felt a flicker of empathy override his fear. "Wait, are you okay?" The boy's voice, full of innocent concern, was the final blow. It was too much. The kindness, the purity, the heroism he had just been praised for, all of it was being directed at him, the monster in the shadows. With a choked, inhuman sound, a sob mixed with a gasp of pain, the watchmaker pushed off the substation and scrambled for the edge of the roof. He didn't look back. He couldn't. "Stop!" Toshinori yelled, taking a step forward. But it was too late. The watchmaker threw himself over the side of the building. He didn't teleport. He didn't have the energy. He simply fell. For a terrifying second, Toshinori thought he was witnessing a suicide. But the man didn't plummet. Halfway down, a shimmering blue portal, ragged and unstable like torn fabric, ripped open in the air. The watchmaker fell through it and vanished. The portal snapped shut with a sound like cracking thunder, leaving nothing behind but the lingering smell of ozone and the deep, unsettling silence. Toshinori and Izuku stood on the rooftop, stunned. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the city. The profound, life-affirming conversation had been shattered by a terrifying, inexplicable encounter. "All Might, what? Who was that?" Izuku asked, his voice trembling. He looked. "I don't know, my boy," Toshinori said, his eyes scanning the spot where the man had vanished. His hand unconsciously went to the wound in his side. The feeling that man exuded, it wasn't the malevolence of All for One. It was something else. A sorrow so deep it felt like a physical force. A power so alien it defied classification. And a familiarity that chilled him to the bone. But he's not a villain I've ever encountered. The energy he gave off, it felt like time itself was wrong around him. They stood in silence for a long time, the weight of the unexplained pressing down on them. The joy and pride of the moment were gone, replaced by a cold sliver of fear and a profound, lingering mystery. Meanwhile, in the darkest, deepest part of an abandoned clock tower, a figure slammed back into reality. The watchmaker crashed onto the stone floor, his body convulsing. The forced teleport had drained the last of his power. The hunger, no longer held in check, erupted. It was no longer a request. It was a demand, a violent, all-consuming need. He was nothing but a void, an emptiness that had to be filled. His vision swam, the world turning into a kaleidoscope of shimmering wakfu. The city, the millions of souls, was a banquet laid out before him, and his self-control was gone, shattered on that rooftop. He crawled, his fingernails scraping against the stone, towards the nearest clock face window. He was no longer fighting. He was surrendering. The watchmaker was gone. Izuku was gone. Only Nox remained, the parasite. He pressed his face against the glass, his breath fogging it. The city lights twinkled below, each one a delicious, tempting morsel of life. "Just a little," the voice of the hunger whispered, his own thoughts now indistinguishable from the parasite's. Just enough to survive. Just a taste. He raised a trembling hand, ready to reach out, to drain, to consume. Ready to become the monster he had fought so hard not to be. Ready to taint the world he had just sworn to protect. The hero had been born on that rooftop, and in the same moment, the monster was about to be reborn in the tower.